In the winter of 1941, the British government issued an emergency directive to every civilian household in the country. It wasn't about shelter, it wasn't about air raid protocols, it was about a plant, a specific plant. One that grew wild in bombed-out lots, along fence lines, in the cracks of destroyed neighborhoods. One that cost nothing to harvest, required no cultivation, and had been feeding European populations for centuries before industrial agriculture told everyone to forget it existed. That same plant today is classified as a noxious weed in 11 American states. In several of them, cultivating it on your property is technically illegal. In some, you're legally required to destroy it if it appears. The British government in 1941 built an emergency food strategy around it. The American government in 2024 has made it a finable offense to grow it. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what this plant is, why governments on two sides of the Atlantic have treated it so differently, and how to harvest, process, and store it yourself, starting this season. Whatever state you're in, stay with this. Because the history of what happened to this plant is not an accident, and this is just one of over 126 forgotten survival foods that kept entire populations alive. I've linked the full guide below if you want the complete list. To understand why this plant mattered, you have to understand what food rationing actually felt like on the ground in wartime Europe. Not the history book version, but the day-to-day reality of trying to feed children when the supply chain was collapsing in real time. Britain introduced rationing in January 1940. Within 12 months, the average civilian was surviving on roughly 1,800 calories per day, and that number was still falling. Bacon disappeared first, then butter, then cooking fat. Meat rations dropped to levels that wouldn't sustain an adult doing physical labor, and every ship carrying food across the Atlantic was running a gauntlet of German submarines that were sinking supply lines faster than they could be replaced. Germany had started earlier. Wartime food restrictions were in place by late 1939. By 1941, urban Germans were operating on ration allocations that fell below basic nutritional requirements. Not uncomfortable, genuinely below the threshold for sustained physical function. Norway, under occupation, faced outright scarcity. Foraging shifted from a rural tradition to an urban survival necessity almost overnight. This is the environment in which governments started issuing foraging guidance. Not as a hobby, not as a wellness trend. As a documented, formal response to the real possibility that civilian populations would starve before the war ended. And across all of it, British pamphlets, German civilian guides, Scandinavian military documentation, one plant appeared consistently. In the summer of 1942, British schoolchildren were organized into coordinated harvesting brigades. They collected over 100 tons of this plant in a single season. Some went to textile and dye production for military use. A significant portion went directly into the civilian food supply. These were not desperate people eating something toxic because they had no choice. These were governments formally recognizing a plant with a documented nutritional profile and deploying it as a strategic resource, which makes what happened after the war even harder to explain. Before the reveal, and before we get to the legal status that is going to make you question everything about how American agricultural policy actually works, you need to understand why this specific plant, out of everything that grows wild, was the one governments kept pointing people toward. The answer is not the nutrition. The nutrition matters, and we'll get to it. But the reason governments cared was the growth pattern. This plant grows in disturbed soil. That is its entire ecological strategy. Colonized disruption. Roadsides, field margins, demolished lots, abandoned ground, the rubble of bombed buildings. Exactly the landscapes that wartime creates in abundance, in a devastated urban environment that made it uniquely available to people who had no garden, no farmland access, and no means to grow conventional crops. A family in a bombed district could walk 50 meters from their front door and find a viable food source. That is not a coincidence. That is the plant doing precisely what it evolved to do. Now the nutrition, framed the way it actually matters for survival. Protein. Dried leaf runs 25 to 30% protein by weight, higher than most plant sources, comparable to legumes, and with an amino acid profile broad enough that Scandinavian military researchers specifically flagged it as a field ration candidate. Iron. Bioavailable iron content exceeds spinach, and bioavailability is the number that matters because your body's ability to absorb plant iron varies dramatically by source. When meat disappears from a diet, iron deficiency follows fast. This plant was one of the only wild sources that could address it at scale. And here is the detail that should reframe everything you thought you knew about food security in America. This plant grows in every climate zone in the continental United States. Every single one. It requires no cultivation investment, no specialized knowledge, no equipment. It is available, free, and nutritionally significant. And it is illegal to grow in 11 states. That's the plant. Now, here's what happened to it. Stinging nettle. That's what the British government built its emergency food strategy around. That's what those schoolchildren harvested by the 100-ton. That's what fed families across Germany, Britain, and occupied Scandinavia while the industrial food supply collapsed around them. And right now in the United States, in these states specifically, Washington, Oregon, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont. Cultivating stinging nettle is a legally restricted act. The classification is noxious weed, and that label carries real legal weight. In most of these states, it means cultivation is prohibited. In some, it means active removal is mandated if the plant appears on agricultural land. Fines exist. In specific jurisdictions, the language extends to land use penalties. Now, here's the question you should be asking. Stinging nettle does not compete with corn. It doesn't outcompete soybeans, wheat, or any commodity crop that forms the backbone of American industrial agriculture. It grows in margins and disturbed zones, not in cultivated fields. The agricultural threat argument, when you examine the plant's actual growth behavior, does not hold up. So, who pushed these classifications and when? Most of them date from a specific window, the late 1940s through the 1960s, the post-war agricultural consolidation era, the same period that saw mass herbicide adoption across American farmland, the standardization of commodity crop monocultures, and the systematic removal of traditional foraging and food self-sufficiency knowledge from mainstream American life. The same era that made buying your food the default and growing or foraging it the exception. The records don't give you a clean answer. There is no single document, no named lobby group, no smoking gun that explains why a wartime survival plant became legally restricted in the country that helped win the war. What the records show is a pattern. A post-war agricultural policy framework that consistently pushed centralized production and consistently discouraged everything that made a household food independent. You're looking at that pattern right now, and in about 3 minutes, I'm going to show you the container growing loophole that gets around most of these restrictions, the one that homesteaders in restricted states are already quietly using. But first, here's exactly how to harvest this plant correctly, because most of the information online gets one critical detail wrong, and that mistake will make you avoid the plant for the wrong reasons. Timing is everything with this plant. Spring is your window, specifically the 6 to 8 weeks after first shoots appear, before flowering begins. You want the top 4 to 6 inches of new growth only. After the plant flowers, it develops compounds that are hard on the kidneys at regular consumption levels. Spring tops. That's the rule, and it's not flexible if you're eating this consistently. The sting. Here's the detail most videos get wrong by either over-dramatizing it or dismissing it. The sting comes from formic acid and histamine loaded into hollow silica needles on the leaf surface. Contact with bare skin causes a burning reaction. Real, uncomfortable, temporary. What most people don't know is that heat or mechanical pressure destroys those needles completely. The moment this plant hits boiling water, the sting is gone. The moment it's fully dried, it's gone. You are only at risk handling raw, fresh plant material against bare skin. Glove-free harvesting is a real technique. Grip the stem firmly. Roll the leaf downward in one smooth motion, and the needles collapse before they can penetrate. It takes practice. For your first harvests, use kitchen gloves. The technique isn't worth learning before you're comfortable with the plant. Now processing. 3 methods, each built for a different survival scenario. Blanching. Drop fresh nettle into hard boiling water for 60 to 90 seconds. Drain and squeeze. What you have is a cooked green that handles exactly like spinach. Add it to soups, sauté with garlic, fold into eggs, mix into anything. This is the direct wartime method, the exact recipe from a 1942 British Ministry of Food pamphlet called for blanched nettle, onion, stock, and potato. 4 ingredients. That combination sustained families through the worst rationing years of the entire war. 4 ingredients. No meat, no imported goods, nothing that required a supply chain. Drying. Hang fresh-cut bundles in a dry, ventilated space out of direct sunlight. Full drying takes 5 to 7 days. Once dry, crumble the leaves from the stems and store in sealed glass jars away from light. Dried nettle retains the majority of its mineral and protein content for up to 12 months. Add it to soups, stews, baking flour, or reconstitute in hot water as a concentrated nutrient tea. This is your long-term storage method, the one that makes this plant a 12-month food security asset rather than a seasonal forage. Juicing. Fresh nettle can be cold-pressed and the juice consumed directly or frozen in portions. High chlorophyll and mineral concentration. Less practical for bulk storage but relevant for anyone building a serious year-round protocol. Storage rule: dried, sealed glass, dark, and cool. 12 months. After that, the color fades and nutritional value drops significantly. Rotate your stock like any other long-term food reserve. Here's what homesteaders in restricted states are actually doing, and why it works. The noxious weed statutes in most of the 11 restricted states are written to target in-ground cultivation, specifically on agricultural land and open soil. Container growing falls into a legal gray zone in the majority of these jurisdictions. Nettle grown in containers, raised beds with defined borders, or enclosed growing systems is not clearly covered by most existing statutory language. This is not legal advice. Read your specific state's agricultural code. But it is the practical reality that homesteaders across restricted states are already operating under, quietly, effectively, and without incident. If you're in an unrestricted state, sourcing is straightforward. Nurseries specializing in edible or medicinal plants increasingly carry Urtica dioica starts. That is the standard edible species. Seeds are widely available and germinate reliably across most conditions. Direct transplant from a clean wild population works if you can identify a source away from roadsides treated with herbicide. One layer most people completely miss. Nettle is not only a food plant. In any serious permaculture setup, it functions as a nitrogen fixer, improving surrounding soil while it grows. Nettle, steeped in water for 2 to 3 weeks, produces a liquid fertilizer that experienced growers use on fruiting plants and vegetables. It acts as a companion plant that deters specific pest species while attracting beneficial insects. The same plant that feeds you rebuilds your soil and protects your other crops. That compounding value is precisely what 70 years of industrial agriculture has trained people to overlook, because a plant that does all of that for free competes with products that cost money. In 1941, a government fighting for survival looked at the bombed-out margins and the neglected fence lines and said, "That plant, that's what we use. They were right. The growth pattern, the nutritional profile, the zero cultivation cost, the availability in exactly the landscapes that war destroys. All of it lined up with what people under real pressure actually needed. The families that listened fed themselves through years that broke the industrial food system completely. 80 years later, the same plant is restricted in 11 states. The knowledge of how to use it has been quietly removed from mainstream food culture. And most people walking past a nettle patch today see a weed to avoid, rather than a resource that once kept families alive. That gap between what people once knew and what we've been guided to forget is exactly what this channel exists to close. If you want the full list of 126+ forgotten survival foods like this, the ones that kept people alive when supply chains failed, I've linked the complete guide in the description. If that's the knowledge you're here for, subscribe. Because next week we're covering a food preservation method the USDA quietly stopped teaching in the 1970s. One that kept root vegetables viable through an entire winter with no electricity, no canning equipment, and nothing you'd need to buy. And the reason it disappeared from the official agricultural guides is exactly as interesting as the method itself.